Well, hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming. We're going to talk about one thing that France and Britain do have in common, which is that both countries have this very strange elite selection method. At 18 or 20, they select the future elite based very largely on your parental home, your social class. It's done by university or grande école entrance, and you are then given a lifetime membership card of the elite, aged 18 or 20. And the other 99% of the population is told, you will never be in the elite, ever. Your chance is gone. Goodbye. And very belatedly, it doesn't have to be like this. So countries like Germany, the Scandinavians, Canada, Australia, they don't do this. They don't select the elite aged 18. And very belatedly, France and Britain are both trying to do something, or pretending at least to do something about social exclusion. So how do we stop our big name institutions from simply funneling overprivileged kids, the Boris Johnsons of the next generation, into the adult elite? And it's not a new problem, it's one that Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, began talking about more than 50 years ago. So now in both countries, we're finally seeing initiatives to improve inclusion. And actually, amazingly, I find things are changing. So for example, at Oxford and Cambridge now, 2/3 of the undergraduates arriving at those universities now are from state schools. That's still way below the proportion of state schools in the population, but still it's about the highest probably in the history of those universities, and many of those kids are even from underprivileged state schools. So how can we take this further? In France, I would say less is happening, it seems to me, but how can these institutions stop reproducing class biases? How can they find the brightest kids, regardless of background? And do we even really want completely intellect-based selectivity? Then there's the question, which is usually raised by the right, of is there a contradiction between elitism and diversity? I'm Simon Cooper from the Financial Times. With me to discuss all this is Fumi Olonishakin and Pierre Mathieu. I'll introduce them. Fumi is Vice President International Engagement and Service at King's College London, and she's trying to help transform King's. And she's also a professor at King's African Leadership Centre in the School of Global Affairs. Pierre Mathieu has been the director of Sciences Po Lille since 2007, where he created an inclusive program for students from marginalized backgrounds. The Sciences Po institutions in France have done more than the rest of the Grande École to improve inclusion. And he's also a professor of political science, and he's now in charge of the French government's reform of the high school baccalaureate. I'm first going to ask each of you, no hissing please, I'm first going to ask each of you to briefly present your views on elitism and diversity. Where are we going? And then we'll have a conversation up here, and afterwards we'll take questions from you. So let's start with Fumi Olonishakin.
Thank you so very much. Good evening, everyone. I think I should say that I originally came from Nigeria about 30 years ago or thereabout. I went to King's College London, and I was deliberate about King's College London because it, for my academic background, was one of the most prestigious institutions. I'm a graduate of War Studies. I did my master's and PhD there. I stayed there. Then I went to the United Nations. I'm starting with this background because where I come from, in a post-colonial Nigeria, I would have been part of the elite automatically because I had a first degree, notwithstanding that my grandfather was an illiterate, right? He couldn't read or write. Coming to King's, and you're right, you suddenly realize that there's that bit of elitism that has to do with class, the affordability of fees. So unlike what you have in France, I think it's slightly different for a grande école. On my program today, a student has to be able to afford £25,000 to study for a master's degree on my program. And I want to challenge very much this idea that elitism is about, that kind of class of money. I want to suggest that elitism has to do with intellectual capability. It has to do with your idea to think and to solve problems for society at the highest of levels. But I understand and I appreciate that there are barriers, there are natural barriers due to social class. So someone like myself could have come to King's. If I didn't have assistance at certain moments, I may not reach where I've reached today. Those barriers are the structures that prevent excellent people from reaching excellent institutions, all right? And therefore, social progress becomes limited. But what I want to put on the table for us to really explore is whose responsibility is it to deal with those social gaps in society, to deal with those structural issues that already mean that at the age of 14, if you do not have the best education that money can buy, you cannot progress to this next level or sit with people of your own intellectual class. That is a challenge. And I think universities have a responsibility, especially universities like mine. King's is at any point in time about number 35 or thereabout, anything from 35 to 38 in the world. I think we have a social responsibility to ensure that in the communities we are, 5 campuses across South London, all right, we're on the Strand. Most of our students are on the Strand, but we have 4 other campuses in some of the poorest parts of London. How can they see us excel? And then you look at those people, they can't progress. And I think it is our duty to help the brightest students in those communities succeed. I can talk later about some of those programs, but it's not just about the job of universities. Governments also have a role, but sometimes I feel that government's policies can be slightly contradictory. We have a widening participation program. We're in London, where 14% of London is black and minority ethnic groups. But actually at King's College London today, because of most of the programs we had put in place in the past, you have more than 55% of those students from black and minority ethnic groups, home students. But at the same time, we're going abroad to bring international students, and we have about 15,000 international, 16,000, depending on what you're counting, from about 150 countries. So we're bringing the wealthiest students in the world to come to King's, even though the student has put us on a widening the government has put us on a widening participation program. What are we doing? Are we recreating marginalization in the countries where we recruit? Because we bring the wealthiest from there, all right? So it means that in those countries where they come to the UK, the brightest and the best will not come to King's or to Oxford or Cambridge or to the Russell Group. So that's where I stand, that there's a measure of responsibility to ensure that elitism and diversity do not go in opposite directions. They should coexist, and they can coexist, but it requires that we take responsibility for something. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pierre Mertour.
Thanks. So I have just 5 minutes, so I will summarize my point to systemic issues. I think that we face 2 fundamental questions, which are first of all, is it really important for French society, and more precisely for the French elite, to open the gates in the educative system? Is it a sincere and sustainable goal? I have to say my honest answer is no. And I say this with my experience at the head of my school in Lille, as well as in the cabinet of French ministers of education, and also as a parent in the educational priority areas. Secondly, what does the expression opening the gates mean? Opening the gates to whom? Women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, people from the working class, people from the countryside. And of course, how could we open these gates? In fact, we have a lot of doors to open at the same time, and I am not sure that it is possible to progress in different fields at the same time. The risk is obviously to multiply symbolic enhancements without structural changes. In my interpretation, opening the gates means giving more space in the higher education to those who have a less privileged origins, and especially in the most selective part of our educational system. In France, these students are, roughly speaking, scholarship students. It can be observed that we have more and more students from a working class or middle class due to the evolution of the place of the baccalaureate in our educational system. In fact, we only counted 10% of baccalaureate winners in a generation at the end of the 60s, 30% in the middle of the 80s. It is more than 80% now. For this reason, the total number of students in France has been multiplied by 10 since the end of the 60s, 300,000 until today, 3 million. In that number, the proportion of the scholarship students in the total of the students is now 38%. It is the highest level in French history. It is a good news for our question tonight of opening the gates, but there is a but, and unfortunately a lot of but. First of all, 20% of a generation stop school before the baccalaureate. It represents 150,000 people every year. These people have very often a foreign origin and are from the poorest part of the population. We could say that they have faced a closing door system. Secondly, in France, the baccalaureate is in fact divided in three: general baccalaureate, technical baccalaureate, and professional baccalaureate. And their reputation is very different in favor, of course, of the general baccalaureate. When we give a look to the social profiles of high school students, we can see that the part of the students with working class origin is 20% in the general baccalaureate, 31% in the technical, and 39% in the professional. And there is also a very important difference between the public high schools and the private high schools concerning the social profile of the students. I add that what we call the private education sector is heavily funded by the state, 75% of private schools' budget, without any condition, notably concerning the social profile of the students. Thirdly, when we take the orientation in higher education into account, we could notice that the rise of the number of students with working class origin doesn't mean that they are more and more present in the most selective and prestigious schools and universities. A few figures and examples. We count 38% of scholarship students on average, but 27% in the top school system, private and public school, and only 11% in École Polytechnique, 15% in HEC, and 19% in École Normale Supérieure, which are three of the more prestigious schools in France. Moreover, they represent only 12% of business school students, but more than 50% of students in the technical curriculum, which are less prestigious. I could also talk about the failure in higher education. 60% of the students who are in the first year failed. And in these 60%, the part of the poorest students is very important. I think that it is possible to say that the rise of the number of students with working class origin doesn't really change the social composition of the most prestigious top school and top university. Surprisingly, we can see an increase of the part of the students with highly favored origins in our top schools. I say that despite the very dynamic action of some very prestigious schools like Sciences Po Paris or Sciences Po Lille, these actions are important, but unfortunately there is not enough of them, and they are more symbolic than game changers. The lines don't actually move or move very slowly. At the end of this very short speech, the question is, what can we do? As Lenin said. Of course, if we think that it is important to do something. So just a few words to conclude about 4 ways to open the gates. First, the French government has recently developed an affirmative action program, which is now legislated, which concerns the higher education system. A part of the top public schools, my schools, for example, have now the obligation to select students from the working class. Of course, if these students apply. If they don't, censor themselves. And self-censorship is a real problem in France. We are just at the beginning of this change, so it is too early to analyze this first evolution. Secondly, the French government has also created an action with public funds. Its name is Ropes of Success, Cordées de la Réussite. For the record, I am one of the parents of this policy. It is a support for students aged between 14 and 18 with working class origin to prepare for the entry in the highest education system. My school in Lille managed the most important program of Ropes of Success in France. The third issue deals with the sense of the words success or achievement. In France, we tend historically to consider that the success in education means to be selected either in a top school, a top grande école, or in a top university of law or else. In fact, the French school system is organized from the beginning to make that possible. Of course, it represents a very small minority of students, very widely from the upper class. I really believe that we have to change, to have a big revolution, to admit that the success cannot be reduced to that kind of curriculum. We have to do that even if it is very difficult, because the very large majority of French decision makers are former students of those schools. Me, for example. The last way to open the gates is the most important and the most difficult. It deals with the first school years. Everybody knows that these years are decisive, particularly for the children from the working class and with foreign origins. We have made some progress in France in that matter, but we have a lot to do. For example, in the training program for the teachers. Just last figures to close my speech. The French government devotes a total of 2 billion euro per year, specifically for the action in the educational priority areas. In this 2 billion, only 3% are devoted to the training of the teachers. It is ridiculous, and it is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Okay. So Pierre gave those 4 very interesting policy ideas, and of course there's some overlap with what UK institutions are thinking about. In your experience at King's, what works in opening the gates?
I think it's clear that we, having had about 20 years of experience now, one of the first things we did about 20 years ago, because I talked about the local communities that surround us, you can't, after a while, sit in an ivory tower and look outside the ivory tower and see very poor neighborhoods and feel comfortable with it. I know Imperial and a couple of other institutions did the same. We, about 2001, then set a framework whereby you bring these young people from the local communities, the migrants, children of migrants, white working class, and so on, into King's on the extended medical program, degree, we call it. Instead of 5 years, they spent 6 years studying medicine, which means you have 1 year to prepare them. It's a sort of foundation year, but it's more than that. But what that means actually is that you have to lowers your tariff, because you bring them in on a slightly lower grade and then prepare them to be successful. And that has worked magic. I think it's partly why we have seen more and more of such students come to King's. But across the institution, I should also say that apart from that, we have, because of the point you were just making earlier, you have to go back to the structures that prevent these young people from being successful. As we were saying earlier, if you are 18 and then we're expecting you to be perfect for the best universities, it's already late. But if at 14, we start preparing you, we have to help you be successful in science, in STEM, in all of it. We have the King's College Math School. It's one of the best in the country now. We have King's academics, PhD students, prepare students in the math school so that at least they can do better at A levels and be ready to come. The last thing we do is not because we did it ourselves. The government almost compels universities these days to show, on the widening participation program, to show what they have done to bring these students into university. But because we started those programs all those years ago, now we're able to say proudly that we have more and more students in the institution who are from various backgrounds, all ethnicities, all religions. And we have to, of course, the burden of it is you prepare the university environment for them. The challenge, though, not just for King's, but for UK universities, is the more of such students you have who are also competing with other international students. The more of such students you have, the more they ask you, when they look at your leadership structures, where are the people that look like us? So I'm the first black woman to be a professor at King's. I'm also the first black woman. So there's a structural issue in it. Also the first black woman as a vice president in King's, but of nearly 9,000 university professors in the UK, less than 100 are black, right? About 40 are black women. And this really is at the heart of the issue. You can say today that it's taken what? More than 100 years or thereabout to have a first Prime Minister of Indian origin in the UK, and yet we see how much people of that community have contributed to UK economy and so on. there's a deeper crisis that we need to continue to do. Before one more point to make. I think we are also inadvertently, because of government policy, in the UK at least, which expects us to make up the funding of universities from the fees of international students. You know that the UK government's international policy, education policy, also says we expect 600,000 international students per year. So in a sense, we're the cash cow for the government. It's an export. It's a big export. But we're not asking ourselves what we're doing to those countries where we bring those students from, because we're replicating the same sort of inequity.
So UK universities are trying for social equity for their British intake, but for the international intake, we just take the richest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah.
Sadly.
It seems to me, as somebody who is British and French, that France is a long way behind on this. I mean, you do have a black president, but only in the TV series Unplus. In real life, maybe in 100 years. So, but in universities as well, as you say, so far, not so good. Now, I was interested in your experience as the architect of the new baccalaureate, the reform of the high school exams. How that has different aims, but in terms of the aim of increasing diversity, of opening the gates, how does the new bac aim to open the gates?
I don't know. We have a black minister now.
Oh, wow.
Yes, but in France it is not a topic. You know, the number of black teachers in the university is not a topic. Not at the moment. I don't know, but I think that the main problem in France is not the reform of the general baccalaureate, because I am in charge of the reform of the general baccalaureate, and the general baccalaureate it's just 50% of the students. Okay, I don't know if you know that, but it's just 50% of the students. Okay, and we have the professional baccalaureate and the technical baccalaureate. Okay, the professional baccalaureate now in France at the moment it is 34% of the students. Okay, and it is a lot of people, and they have working class origin. They are from the poorest area of the state. And I think it is a question of representation of what is a professional baccalaureate, a technical baccalaureate, and a general baccalaureate. In France, when you, at the end of the college, when you are 14 years, and the teachers have a meeting to organize the lycée, when they say you are going to the professional baccalaureate, it is not a good news. It is a punishment. Okay? Yes, it's a kind of punishment. Okay, and according to a large part of the population in France, and the teacher, you have a hierarchy between the three baccalaureates. So
I just feel that there isn't as much of a sense of urgency. As you say, for example, the number of black professors is not a subject. I was at a talk at the École Normale Supérieure this week. I was in the audience. And there were 8 speakers, 7 white men, and 1 white woman. And I thought, as a British equivalent institution, I don't think that would happen now, would it? Do you think? It would be unusual.
No, it would be, at least the gender, on the gender front, it will be highly insensitive to find.
Yeah, and so I was really surprised that École Normale Supérieure, which does the social sciences, and Bourdieu's kind of home base, you'd think there'd be some reflection on this. Not at all, it seemed. Do you think that there is a kind of growing awareness in the all-white elite that this is a little bit of a problem, or it's not a big deal?
One woman, it is a good news. She was Italian, so okay. Oof. No, I think that we have more and more women in the teacher group. Okay, and there is a policy in France at the moment to make women in to become professor. Yeah, we have incentives to do that. In my school, for example, we have to do that. When the government creates a job of professor, he said, okay, we create one, but it is for women. Okay, so it is a good news, I think. But we are not in the system in the UK with the color of it is forbidden in France to have ethnical statistics. It is forbidden. So yeah, we are working on that. But I think that the main issue in France now is that we have a lot of local policy, Sciences Po Paris, Sciences Po Lille, and so on and so forth, but not, I think, a systemic policy, a national policy everywhere in the country, I think. Okay, and although we have another problem with the public and private sector, because as you know, I think when you are a student in the university, it's free. Yes, it's free. It's under 300 euro per year. When you have to pay your fees, okay, and 38% of students does not pay anything. In my school, because Sciences Po Lille is a public school, I have 30% of students with scholarship. It's totally free for them. Okay, and for them, for those who have a very privileged origin, it is just 4,000 euro per year. So I think for British it's free. Okay, but before the highest education system, we have the lycée and the college, and in the lycée and the college, as you know, we have private sector and public sector. Okay, 20% of the students in France are in private sector with funds from the state, 75%, and no obligation to welcome boys and girls from underclass origin. Okay, so it is a very important issue, because when you are at the government, I am working for the minister at the moment, when you want to organize the school map, because in France you have a school map, the private sector is not in the school map. So when you are parents and you say, ooh, you want to I have to make my boy or my girl in this college or this lycée with working class boys and girls. No, I have the private sector. Okay.
Luckily in Britain we don't have the private school problem, it doesn't exist here. But just lastly, before I open it to the audience, it seems to me that in the last 5 years in Britain there has been a kind of, the institutions have been embarrassed into opening the gates or trying to open the gates. How successful do you think that effort has been?
No, I think really, despite all my criticisms, I would say this really is a welcome thing. And there are two things to be said in that respect. Some things we now have to self-report, sometimes self-censor ourselves if we look at the statistics. The advantage we have in the UK over France is we really can take data, all right, based on ethnicity, based on socioeconomic status and so on, based on genders as well. We also have benchmarking institutions. You've seen some of the debate of late. We have the advanced HE. We have institutions that benchmark us on race equality. We have Athena Swan. We have disability. Of course, with all the debates around Stonewall, but the fact is that when you look at LGBTQI status in the universities, all those things have open data, and you can access that. And I think that's actually more of an advantage, because it compels us to set targets or aspire to some standards, and every few years we're held, to account on the basis of what we promised. But I think it's a work in progress. Mm-hmm. It's a work in progress, but you can actually see it, and we can have that debate. I really think the biggest challenge for me, as I see it, it's the contradictions between government policy and the kind of work of universities. And I say that because, on the one hand, if the state is saying they set the fees 9,250, it's been set like that for a long time. We even had a moment where it seemed as though it would be decreased to about 7,500. The OGA report, then I think it's been quiet for some time. But when you look at inflation and the fact that there's no additional funding from the state, and we have to generate those resources ourselves, it means that therefore you try to make things equal with one hand, and then you increase inequality.
By taking in rich people from the global south.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's open this to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Wow. Okay, let's, the four of you, okay, brief questions please, from starting with you.
So I think this issue about talking about numbers and trying to see how many people are represented, how many people of color or gender are represented in the institution, I think it's a good measure of how well things are going. But I also think it's quite blinding at times. And I think what you'd read in a headline, which may be there are X amounts of colored people and X amounts of white people in this institution, which might seem positive at first, might actually hide the deeper progress that needs to be made. Because I think that there should be a bigger focus on what communities are doing and how this is affecting communities on the smaller scale rather than what the people at the top are feeling. So how important do you think this focus on numbers should be in the media or in overall representation of these issues?
Do you want to take that?
Absolutely. Honestly, I think that's a really good question because the numbers don't say it all. Certainly the numbers say a lot though when you look at representation. It's not so much numbers as much as representation when you have the vast majority of your students in the institution being from that kind of diverse group, but you look at the leadership of the institution, it's not that diverse. All UK institutions have this issue at the moment. But where I really tend to agree with you is that even when you look at internationalization and they say, oh, these are the best, this is the most international university in the world, King's College London, we celebrate, we're number 10, 11, 14, whatever we are, and everybody does that. We look at the numbers of students and staff that are international. Of course, one of the measures we use, that QS or Times Higher Education would use, is who's publishing with who across borders. That's good data because that's the product of research. But hardly often do we ask, what is the quality of life of the student in that institution? All right? So we celebrate all of these numbers, but we don't ask how successful they are. The one thing we've not talked about this evening is the question of attainment gap. That's
question of
attainment gap. That when you compare on balance, those black or minority ethnic group students, especially black students, are 20%, 2 times, maybe 1/5 times less likely to have a first class than their white counterparts. So some of the structural issues continue. So you raise a very important point. It's not just about the numbers.
Okay, more questions, but brief questions, brief answers, please. Okay. This lady here.
Actually, this is going to be very similar to you, but I'll try to be very brief. Basically, my only question is that when you think about these elitist schools, do you think about that when people come from unrepresented background, they will feel like they will have to conform to what is there, the people, how they act, how they speak, that everything that I bring with me is taught in that school that is not something as appropriate there, that I should act this way in order to go and be successful.
Yes, it's true, and I think it's for this reason that we have to work with the kids when they are young, because if we begin the program when they have 18, it is too late, because in that school you have a tradition to speak, okay, and if you begin with that kids when they are at the end of the French college, for example, I think it is a good idea because you are working along the years until the baccalaureate, and then after that they made application to be in my school, for example, okay? If you begin too late, I think you have no action really important on the system, I think.
Sorry, can I comment very quick?
Very brief.
Very quick. It's just, but my problem is that you're still teaching them at the very beginning that what they have shouldn't be something that should be considered in the elitist school. So that is against the representation of their background. And it should be about some sort of representation in the high school. My question is, should it be actually represented or not in a school like this?
Okay, next question, lady here.
I wanted to ask, opening the gate, what happens inside the gates? I'm a King's student, and I think there's this very detachment between the very diverse backgrounds of UK students that we have and international students, where there's a huge social wealth gap and also sometimes language. And I wonder, how can we bring these together, that people talk to each other and don't stay in the groups in the educational institutions?
I think that I need to answer that question. No, you're very right. Part of the point I was trying to make about bringing so many international students in from diverse backgrounds is exactly that, because we also create some structural problems, by so doing. The language issue is huge. But even though we create facilities to make that happen, it's not necessarily easy to do. But I also think that that's where having the kinds of distinctive programs, and you're probably familiar with some of them, the leadership programs, the King's Edge, and so on. I think that it still counts for too few, because the number of international and UK students who can be on those programs to help them out are far too few for the scale of the need, isn't it? Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah.
One more from this side, and then I'll go to the other side. Go on.
So you noted that there was a difference between, opening the gates in France and the UK, and it seems that one of the explanations that you give is a difference in government policy and in education policy. Now, I understand it, but I have another hypothesis, and I'd like to know what you think. I think that there are structural differences in the education system in the UK and in France. For example, France has a big, they love the idea of the concours, and in France, essentially, you are graded based on your rank, and for example, for the École Polytechnique and the class préparatoire, you will get into the school based on your grades and not based on your social origin. And do you think that in the UK this isn't necessarily that much of an issue, so this could be an explanation to why France is a bit behind in the UK on this front?
Sorry, but to get into British universities, your grades are important.
Yes, they are important, but in France, you are literally graded on an Excel spreadsheet, and if you're in the top 10, you'll get in, and if you're not, then you won't.
Pierre, do you want to comment briefly on that? How the ranking, why the ranking is so important in France? Why do people say 40 years after X, this person was top of the promotion?
I say that for me, yeah, of course. It is changing, I think. But what is not changed is École Polytechnique, it's École Polytechnique, okay? It's not École Centrale. And in École Normale Supérieure, as you know, École Normale Supérieure from Ulm, it's not École Normale Supérieure from Lyon, okay? And Sciences Po Paris, I'm from Sciences Po Paris, it's not Sciences Po Lille, okay? Yeah. So it is on our mind, okay? Even my mind.
But yeah, your point was specifically about the ranking and the grades, the ranking system which British schools don't really have anymore, the public schools used to. Let's have a question from this side. There's a hand at the back.
So if I want to extend a point that somebody has raised before, which is about once you open the gates, what happens in the gates or in the room that has been created. And if the notion of elitism is not simply about reproducing elites, but also about reproducing a very different idea of what elitism is about, could you speak a little bit about the work that you do at King's around cultural competency, the decolonized conversations? What is happening in that space that also challenges ideas around elitism?
See, I was trying to answer those questions very briefly, but really one of the things I established in the last 4 years or so is a cultural competency program, precisely because of the point that was raised earlier. I was talking about King's Edge and the leadership programs, but the cultural competency program was established precisely to deal with what happens inside the institution. Some students coming from China, from wherever they come in, they don't understand, if you like, it's not so much the language, but the idioms and expressions. Some come in there from a different religious background, different classes and so on, and therefore trying to conform to what you expect to be a standard framework would not do. So they're not equally successful. Not just that, there's a power hierarchy even in the classroom. There's a power hierarchy it's not just the disciplines in the way that they're taught, and students themselves express this a lot. What we've done now with the cultural competency is we call it the ability to see the world through the eyes of another across the diversity. So that I need to understand what it means to be a young girl that grew up in Beijing, right? If I want to really understand and now we're filtering it into the curriculum, into various programs. It's not just students who offer it, and I want to know whether as a student you've come into contact with this. About 2,500 students have registered on it, and now we've just had one for staff. There's no point you're asking a student to be culturally competent in a place where there are about 162 citizenships, right? But you must ask your teachers to be culturally competent and your program administrators as well. I have a feeling this is one of the reasons, more than a feeling, this is one of the reasons why we have not done as well as we need to do in NSS. Because if you don't feel that sense of belonging within the institution, it's not going to be easy.
I mean, one question about British and French elite schools is the point to teach students who may not know how to behave like an upper middle class British person or how to behave like a French bourgeois? So that if you arrive without knowing the modes and the kinds of conversation that is expected in the ruling class, that you learn it there, and also how to use the right fork when you eat which dish.
I think it is difficult to be a bourgeois without the manner of a bourgeois. When I was student in the 80s, I have working class origin. I am from the countryside with an accent, and I remember Pierre Bourdieu. He was my most popular work because I read Bourdieu and I was in Sciences Po Paris in the 80s with a lot of bourgeois. And if you don't play like a bourgeois, it is hard to succeed. I think.
Yeah. Well, Bourdieu was the son of a postman.
Yeah.
But then he explains elite reproduction, but he mastered it himself. So all three of Bourdieu's sons went through the École Normale Supérieure. So he was the winner of the elite reproduction system that he...
Okay, yeah, of course. And he has an accent. He has the original, but his accent, and how it was difficult to have not this accent, because it was socially a kind of social position to have an accent.
Okay. But can I just say now that there's a diversity of elitism in that way? So the bourgeoisie in the UK context looks different. You can come from China, not understand the language too much, speak with your accent, but you can fly in and out of the country between London and Beijing twice a month and carry a Gucci bag, okay? You can be in the UK and have your accent, a British student, and speak impeccable English that the Chinese cannot speak, but you can come from Kenya and actually really have the money to buy out almost anything. So you understand, it's so complex these days.
Rishi Sunak's family comes from Kenya.
Thank you. Yeah. It's so complex these days. So everyone now has their interpretation of the elitism. What they have in common is the king's education. And they go to their countries and feel like kings and queens because they have just come from King's College London with a certificate. Well, I have King students in the room. Maybe they can attest to that.
Last question now. This lady here.
Yes, you mentioned what happens when gates are open. I understand that to overcome the self-inhibition, you need models and maybe help them to come into King's or other university. Now, inside the university or the school, what do you think about the equal-to-equal type of connections, the buddy programs or mentoring, which are more adapted to individuals rather than having a global policy, but also having a more, I don't know the word, but shaped type of approach to help individuals to raise into...
Okay, so buddy or mentoring programs, very brief response from each of you.
No, this is something we have through multiple programs at King's. The cultural competency, but something called the Principal's Global Leadership Award. By the time you've gone through a variety of programs, about 5 things in that area, you actually feel some kind of, you feel this self-confidence, which is what we're trying to get our students to have. Regardless of accent, regardless of whatever it is, you begin to propel yourself differently. That's the idea.
Yes, it works, but it is very difficult to manage individual and the collective. Okay, so yeah, especially in France.
My overlords tell me we're having one last question from this lady here.
Actually, I wanted to say that opening the gates and diversity, but why? We should maybe keep in mind the purpose of the diversity. What is it for? Is it for helping less lucky children or students to access to a better education? And once they are in King's College or Sciences Po, what do we want to bring to them? Do we want to help them reach the kind of job that wealthy family children can get, in which case it does not surprise me that they need to teach, to learn how to talk, how to behave, etc. And this is not a negative point for the diversity, because diversity is not a purpose on itself. Diversity must serve the people, this student that we try to help, right? And it's not to the point is not I think to pretend to speak like a bourgeois or an aristocrat, but we need, if the code to reach the purpose of the diversity, the job that we want them to get, they need to speak in a certain way. Then let's help them. Sorry. Yeah.
No, just a word. I think that diversity serves the society. Yes, in France, for example, if we have some member of the elite, which are a lot of different origin, I think it will be good for our society. Just that.
So getting a job is automatic.
Yes.
At a particular level. You get a job. But being a decent human being who can go on behalf of United Nations, your country, and so on, and make society more equal and not replicate the wickedness in society for conflict, for inequality again, is the biggest deal of this. The more you understand yourselves in a diverse way and you understand the problems of society, the better you will do your job well. Because I think it's not just a job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.